There are some things a man sees once and carries with him until the day they put him in the ground. I have buried 2 wives, a brother, and a horse I loved more than most people I've known. I've watched a drought crack the earth open like an old man's hands, and I've watched a river come back and drown the same land the following spring. I thought I was past being surprised. I thought the desert had already shown me everything it had to show. Then on a Tuesday I can no longer forget, I saw an old donkey drag a cart up a road that would have killed a younger animal, and nobody on that whole crowded street so much as turned a head. They stepped around him. They cursed him for slowing traffic. A boy threw a stone that bounced off the cart's side, and the donkey did not even flinch, because flinching would have cost him a step, and he could not afford to lose a step. And I have to tell you, before I tell you the rest, that what was inside that cart is the reason I am not the same man I was before I looked. I have chewed on it for 11 years now. I've tried to write it down 4 times and burned the pages each time because words kept making it smaller than it was. So I'm not going to make it pretty. I'm going to tell it the way it happened, in the order it happened, and I'm going to trust you to feel what I felt without me standing over your shoulder telling you when to feel it. But I'll warn you of this much. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever carried something heavy that nobody bothered to ask about, if you've ever kept walking when every reason in the world said stop, this story is going to sit in your chest a while. Stay with me. The donkey's name, I'd learn, was Morrow, and what he was carrying up that hill was heavier than the cart. The town was called Arroyo Seco, which means dry creek, and whoever named it had a sense of humor or a grudge. Because for 8 months of the year that was exactly what it was, a dry creek and a scattering of adobe and tin that squatted along it like it was waiting for water that mostly didn't come. I'd ridden in that morning to sell a string of horses and buy salt, coffee, and a length of chain, and I was in the sourest mood a man can be in without actually being sick. My knee had been aching since San Marshall. My hat had a hole in it that let the sun straight through onto the exact center of my scalp. And the buyer for my horses, a fat man named Delgado who wore a gold ring on every finger except the one that mattered, had offered me less than half of what the animals were worth and smiled while he did it. So I want you to understand, I was not looking for anything that morning. I was not the kind of man who went around collecting causes. I'd spent 31 years learning to mind my own business, because minding your own business is how you keep your own business alive out here. You help every stray dog and every sad story that crosses your path, and pretty soon you're the stray dog. That was my thinking. That had always been my thinking. The street was full the way it got on the days the freight came through. Mule teams. A Mexican family selling melons off a blanket. 2 army men leaning against the cantina wall, pretending they weren't drunk before noon. Dust hanging in the air so thick you could taste the whole town in the back of your throat. Copper and manure and somebody frying onions somewhere down an alley. And into all of that came the donkey. I heard him before I saw him. That's the thing I always come back to. Before I ever laid eyes on that animal, I heard the sound of him, and it was a sound I'd never heard an animal make and haven't heard since. It wasn't braying. It wasn't the ordinary complaint of a beast that's been worked too hard. It was a kind of rhythmic, dragging exhalation. H-H-H, H-H-H, H-H-H. The sound of something that has decided breathing and walking are the same act now and cannot be separated without the whole system stopping. I turned toward it the way you turn toward a wrong note in a song. He came around the corner by the church, and the first thing that struck me was that he should not have been standing, let alone pulling. He was old. Not old the way you say a working animal is old. Old the way you say a man is old when you mean he's earned the right to sit down and never get up again. His coat, which might once have been the color of good ash, had gone patchy and gray-white around the muzzle and the eyes, and his ribs stood out under the skin like the staves of a barrel somebody had let dry out and shrink. And behind him that cart, loaded high, loaded stupid, is what I thought at first, loaded the way a fool loads a cart when he's never had to pull one himself. Crates and sacks and something under a tarp, roped down tight, the whole thing riding heavy on two wheels that wobbled with every rotation like they were thinking about quitting. There was no driver. That's what took a second to register. I kept looking for the man who ought to have been walking beside that cart or dozing on the seat, and there wasn't one. There was no seat, just the donkey in his harness, alone, pulling a load that would have made two fresh mules lean into it, up the slow rise of the main street toward the far end of town where the road climbed out of the arroyo and went up into the hills. Alone. I've thought a lot about why nobody helped him. I don't think it was cruelty, mostly. Cruelty takes a kind of attention, and the thing about that street was that nobody was paying any attention at all. He was furniture. He was weather. He was a slow-moving obstacle between one person and wherever that person was going, and the entire moral response the town could muster was mild irritation. A freighter cursed him for blocking the way and hauled his own team around. A woman pulled her child to the far side of the street, not out of fear, just out of the instinct to keep moving. And the boy, I mentioned the boy threw the stone. I saw it leave his hand. I saw it strike the side of the cart with a hollow crack, and I saw the donkey not flinch, and I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make that into something noble, and it wasn't noble, it was worse than noble. It was the stillness of an animal so far past its own limits that a stone off the flank simply did not rank against the war he was already fighting inside his own body. He didn't flinch because he couldn't spare it. Flinching was a luxury. He was spending everything he had on the next step, and the step after that, and there was nothing left over for anything else in the world. I sat my horse and I watched him, and I felt the first thing crack in me that I'd kept sealed a long time. Now here is where I'd like to tell you I leapt down off my horse and rushed to help. I didn't. I want to be honest about that because the honesty is the whole point. I sat there. I watched an old animal killing himself in slow motion in the middle of a public street, and my first, cold, practical thought was, that's not my donkey, and that's not my problem, and I have salt and coffee and chain to buy. I even turned my horse's head. I did. I started to ride on. And then the donkey stopped. He didn't collapse. That would have been easier to walk away from, God help me. He just stopped. In the middle of the rise at the steepest part where the road bent up toward the hills, the load beat him and he stopped, and his four legs were splayed and shaking and his head hung down between them almost to the dirt, and that terrible breathing kept going, H-H-H, 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 and the cart began very slowly to roll backward. You have to understand what that meant. A loaded cart on a grade, once it starts rolling back, it doesn't stop being a problem. It gathers. And there was a whole street of people down below him and children, and that donkey knew it. I'd swear on anything you like that he knew it, because he threw himself against the harness in a way he had not done for the boy or the freighter or any insult the town had offered him, and his old shaking legs found something, God knows where, and he held. He held the cart, on the grade, by himself, and nobody, not one soul on that street seemed to see it happen. That was when I got down off my horse. I don't remember deciding to. I remember being in the saddle, and then I remember being on the ground with the reins still in my hand and my knee screaming, and I remember walking toward him. And the closer I got, the more I saw, and the more I saw, the slower I walked, because some part of me already understood I was walking toward something I was not going to be able to unsee. He smelled like dust and old sweat, and underneath that, faintly, like sickness. His eyes, when I came around to the front of him, were the milky blue-gray of an animal going blind, and they rolled toward me with an expression I have never been able to name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pleading. If I had to put a word to it, and I've had 11 years to try, it was apology. Like he was sorry. Like he thought he'd done something wrong by stopping and was bracing for me to be one more person who'd curse him for it. Easy, I said. Easy now, I've got you, I've got it. And I put my shoulder against the back of that cart, and I pushed. Lord, it was heavy. I'm not a small man, and I was strong then, stronger than I am now, and I leaned into that cart with everything I had, and for a second it didn't move at all, and I understood in my body, in my burning legs and my grinding knee, what that animal had been doing. Alone. For how long? I didn't know yet. But I knew in that moment that whatever it was he'd been pulling, and however far he'd pulled it, No fresh, strong animal in its prime should have been able to move it up that grade, and he was neither fresh nor strong nor in his prime, and he'd been doing it anyway. I got it moving. Between the two of us, the dying donkey and the sour cowboy who'd been about to ride away, we got that cart up over the crown of the rise to where the road leveled off, and there, on the flat, he stopped again, and this time I let him, and I set the wheel with a rock so it couldn't roll, and I came around to stand by his head while he breathed. His whole body was shuddering. Foam had dried white at the corners of his mouth, and now that we were stopped and the immediate danger was past, I finally did the thing I should have done 100 yards back, the thing the whole town should have done, the thing that separates the people who look from the people who don't. I looked in the cart. I pulled back one corner of that tarp, expecting freight, expecting the ordinary heavy nothing that animals haul from one dry town to another, flour, maybe, or ore, or hides. And I want to stop here. I want to stop here because I've learned that if I go too fast through this next part, it comes out sounding like a story I made up, and it wasn't. It was real, and it was quiet, and it was the most human thing I have ever found inside a cart pulled by an animal, and if you'll let me, I'll tell you the rest slow, the way it deserves. Under the tarp, packed in around the crates so it wouldn't shift, wrapped in 3 blankets against the cold that comes down hard in that country at night, was a man. An old man, older than the donkey, if such a thing was possible. His eyes were closed and his face was the gray-yellow of tallow, and for one horrible second I was sure I was looking at a corpse, that this animal had been dragging a dead man up out of the desert for reasons I would never learn. Then his chest moved, shallow and slow, but it moved. He was alive, barely, and pinned to the blanket over his chest with an ordinary sewing pin was a square of paper, and on the paper, in a hand that shook so badly the letters barely held together, were words I have carried in my head every day since. I'll tell you what they said, but not yet, because to understand what they meant, to understand why an old blind donkey was carrying a dying old man up out of the desert alone, with no driver, toward a town that couldn't be bothered to look, you have to understand who they were to each other. And that's a story the old man himself told me in pieces, over the 3 days it took him to either die or not. He didn't die on the first day. I'll give you that much now so you can breathe. The rest I'll tell you in order. I carried him to the mission at the end of the street, Santa Rita, a low white building with a bell that hadn't rung in years, and a sister named Concepcion who took one look at the man in my arms and cleared a table without asking a single question. She'd seen men brought in like that before. In that country in those years, you learned not to waste breath on questions until you knew whether there'd be anyone left to answer them. I laid him down. Sister Concepcion went to work with the flat competence of a woman who has fought death enough times to neither fear nor respect it, and she shooed me out, and I found myself standing in the packed dirt yard of the mission with a donkey I did not own and did not want and could not, now, possibly abandon. He'd followed us, that's the thing. I'd unhitched him from the cart intending to leave him tied in the shade, and he'd worked the knot loose, or Sister Concepcion had, I never was sure, and he'd followed the man's body all the way to the mission door and planted himself in the yard and would not be moved. He stood there with his head low and his sides heaving and his blind eyes pointed at the door the man had gone through, and when I tried to lead him to water he wouldn't come. He wouldn't leave the door. I've owned a lot of animals. I've been loved by a few of them, in the plain, uncomplicated way animals love, which is mostly about food and safety and the sound of your voice. I had never in my life seen an animal do what that donkey was doing, which was to stand watch, to refuse comfort, refuse water, refuse rest, and stand between a closed door and the whole indifferent world as if his standing there could hold the man on the living side of it. So I did the only thing that made sense. I brought the water to him. I set the bucket down right beside him so he could drink without leaving his post, and he did, finally, drink, long and desperate, and then he went back to watching the door, and I sat down in the dirt beside him with my aching knee stretched out in front of me and my ruined hat in my hands, and I waited too. That was the first night. Around the middle of it, Sister Concepcion came out and stood in the doorway wiping her hands and looked at me, and looked at the donkey, and something in her face softened by a degree. "He's asking for the animal," she said. "He's awake. In and out, mostly out, but when he's in, he's not asking for water and he's not asking for a priest." She tilted her head toward the donkey. "He's asking for him, says the name over and over, Morrow." The donkey's ears came up. "I want to tell you that plainly, because I know how it sounds." The animal had been standing with his head hanging for hours, past exhaustion, blind and old and used up, and the woman said one word from that doorway, a name spoken by a man the donkey couldn't see, and both of those long gray ears came up and swiveled toward the door, and something went through the whole body of that animal like a current through a wire. Morrow, that was his name, and somewhere in that dark room a dying man was saying it, and the donkey heard. "Let him in," I said. "I don't know where the certainty came from. Sister, whatever the rule is, let him in." She looked at me a long moment, then she stood aside from the door. I have thought since that she must have known, that she'd guessed already what the two of them were to each other, the way women who have spent their lives near dying people learn to guess the shape of a love from the shape of the grief around it. She stood aside from the door of a house of God and let a donkey walk in across the tile, and she did it without one word of objection, and I have loved her for it ever since, though I never saw her again after that week. Morrow walked in. His unshod hooves clicked on the tile, slow, uncertain, his blind head swinging side to side, following the sound of the breathing and I think the smell of the man until he came to the table where the old man lay, and he stopped, and he lowered his great gray head down over that frail chest, and he stood. And the old man's hand came up off the blanket. It took everything he had, I could see it cost him, his whole arm shaking like a branch in wind. And he laid that hand flat against the side of the donkey's face, and he said the name once more, soft, almost nothing, almost only breath. "Morrow." And the donkey closed his blind eyes. I had to go outside. I'm not ashamed to say it. A grown man, a hard man, a man who told himself for 31 years that the whole trick of survival was to not care about things that weren't your own. I had to walk out into that cold desert night and stand under all those stars and put my hand over my own mouth so the sister wouldn't hear me, because something had come loose in my chest that I did not know how to get back where it belonged. I didn't want to know their story. That's the truth. Standing out there in the dark, I understood that if I let myself learn it, it would become mine to carry, and I already knew how it was going to end, and I did not want one more heavy thing to haul around the rest of my life. But the note. I kept coming back to the note. That square of paper pinned to his chest in that shaking hand. Because you don't pin a note to yourself for the person who finds your body. You pin a note to yourself for the person you're praying finds you before you're a body. It was a message sent forward into a future the old man wasn't sure he'd live to see. And by the accident of a bad mood and a knee that ached and a stone thrown by a bored boy, I was the future it had reached. I still had it in my shirt pocket. I took it out there under the stars, and I turned it toward the moon, and I read it again, though I already knew every word. And I'll tell you what it said now, because you've come this far, and it's not right to make you wait for it the way I made myself wait. It said, "Please, he's carried me 40 years. Whatever you do to me, be kind to him. His name is Morrow. He does not understand that I am dying. Please don't let him watch." 40 years. I stood there, and I did the arithmetic against everything I'd seen. The blind eyes, the ribs like barrel staves, the way that animal had thrown himself against a rolling cart to save a street of strangers, the way he'd stood watch at a door and refused water, the way one whispered name had lifted his ears out of the grave he was standing in. And I understood that I was not looking at an animal hauling freight. I was looking at the last 40 years of two lives that had been, somehow, one life, coming to their end together on a dry road that nobody else had bothered to look at. And I understood that the old man had done a thing in the writing of that note that I don't think I could have done. He was dying. He was in pain. He had every right in the world to spend his last strength on his own fear, his own comfort, his own soul. and instead he had spent it worrying about whether his donkey would have to watch him go. Don't let him watch. I went back inside. Sister Concepcion was sitting by the table with her rosary, and the old man's eyes were open, and they found me, and the first thing he said to me, the very first words that old man ever spoke to me directly, in a voice like paper tearing, were not about himself. "Did he pull the whole way?" he asked. "Tell me true, did Morrow have to pull the whole way alone?" And I had to decide, right then, whether to tell that dying man the truth. That yes, his beloved animal had dragged him miles up out of the desert alone, half blind and half dead, past a whole town that wouldn't lift a hand, or whether to give him a kinder thing to carry out of the world. That was the first of the choices. There would be others, harder ones, before the 3 days were out. But that was the first, and I want to end this part there, on that question hanging in that small, dark room, because I've never been sure I answered it right, and I'd like you to sit with it the way I've had to. What would you have told him? I know what I told him. I'll show you in the next part, and I'll tell you how the old man and Morrow came to belong to each other in the first place, 40 years back, in a story that begins with a flood and a rope and a boy who wasn't supposed to survive. But not yet. Let the question sit. Let it be heavy. That's the only honest way I know to carry it forward. Here is what I told him. I'll get it out of the way because I promised you I would, and because a promise you make a reader is the only kind you can't sneak out of. The old man, Elias, though I didn't have his name yet, looked up at me from that table with his ruined eyes and asked whether Morrow had pulled the whole way alone. And I stood there and I felt the truth in my mouth, heavy and cold as a stone. And I looked past him to the donkey with his blind head bowed over the man's chest, and I made my choice. "No," I said. "No, sir. There were 3 of us on that cart by the end. A freighter took the far side and I took the near, and your donkey walked between us like he was leading a parade. He didn't pull alone. Folks came out. Folks helped." It was a lie. It was a flat, clean, unashamed lie, and Sister Concepcion heard me tell it and never so much as blinked, and I have never once regretted it. There are truths a man is owed, and there are truths a man has already paid too much for, and Elias had paid 40 years. He did not need to spend his last hours knowing that the world had watched his best friend drag him toward death and called it a traffic problem. Something eased in his face when I said it. His breath came a little slower, a little deeper. "Good," he whispered. "Good. He always thought better of people than they deserved. I didn't want the last thing. I didn't want him to learn different at the end." And then he told me. Not all at once. He hadn't the strength for all at once. But over that night and the 2 that followed in bursts between the sleeping, he gave me their whole story, and I gave him my ears. And by the end I understood that I had not stumbled onto a sad thing on a street. I had stumbled into the last chapter of an epic that no one had written down and no one ever would unless it was me, and I've spent 11 years working up the nerve. So here it is, Elias and Morrow, the beginning. He was 19 the year the river came up. This would have been, by my arithmetic from what he told me, better than 40 years before I met him, back when the whole territory was younger and meaner, and the towns were half the size and twice as desperate. Elias worked then for a freight outfit that ran goods along the river bottoms, and in the spring of that year, the snow up in the high country melted all at once, the way it does maybe once in a generation, and the river that most months was a brown trickle you could step across came down through the canyons like the hand of God sweeping a table. He was caught out in it with a string of pack animals. The water took the road, then took the animals, then took him. He told me he remembered going under, and the cold of it, the shock of it, and how the river rolled him along the bottom among the stones so that he couldn't tell up from down, and how he'd made his peace in that first minute with drowning. He was 19 and he'd already decided he was going to die, and there was a strange calm in the deciding. And then something had him by the collar. Not a hand. He knew that even then in the dark and the roar. It was teeth. Something had closed its teeth on the back of his collar and was dragging him, and he fought it at first because a drowning man fights everything. And then he stopped fighting because he understood he was being pulled toward the bank. And then his knees hit gravel and he was crawling up out of the water on his hands and knees, coughing up half the river. And when he could finally lift his head and look at what had saved him, he saw a young donkey standing over him in the rain. A half-grown donkey. Somebody's stray or somebody's runaway. An animal with no brand and no owner that had been standing on that bank when the river brought Elias past, close enough to shore, and had waded into a flood that had already killed grown men and strong mules that spring, and taken a drowning stranger by the collar and hauled him out. Nobody could tell me why, Elias said. His voice, when he told me this, had a wonder in it that 40 years hadn't worn down. Everybody I ever asked said an animal wouldn't do that. Said no donkey walks into a flood for a stranger. Said I must have dreamed it or made it up, or that somebody must have really pulled me out and I was too far gone to know it was a man. He was quiet a moment. Morrow breathed over him in the dark. But I know what had me by the collar, he said. I've known for 40 years, and every person who told me it couldn't have happened, I noticed something about them. They were always the kind who wouldn't have waded in themselves. I have thought about that line more than almost anything else that old man said to me. They were always the kind who wouldn't have waded in themselves. Because isn't that the truth of it? The people quickest to tell you that no one would do a selfless thing are usually telling you something about themselves and nothing about the world. Elias named him Morrow that same night for the dark color he'd been in his youth, and from that day the two of them were not a man and his animal. They were something else, something the language doesn't have a clean word for. Elias put it best himself near the end when he said, "He didn't belong to me and I didn't belong to him. We belonged to what happened in that river. You can't undo a thing like that. You can only keep it." They kept it for 40 years. I couldn't write down everything he told me. There was too much, and a lot of it came in fragments I had to fit together afterward like a broken pot. But I'll give you the shape of the 40 years, because the shape is the thing. They worked. That was the spine of it. A man and a donkey hauling, always hauling, freight, water, firewood, or other people's belongings, other people's dead. When the freight outfit folded, Elias bought Morrow off them for the price of a week's wages, which was the only time in either of their lives that money ever changed hands over the donkey, and Elias said he felt ashamed doing it. Buying a creature that had bought his life for free. They were poor, bone poor, the kind of poor that doesn't photograph and doesn't make it into stories because there's nothing dramatic about it, just the slow grind of 2 lives spent carrying loads for other people so they could afford to keep carrying loads for other people. Elias never married. Came close twice, he told me, and then a long silence, and I understood I wasn't going to hear about the 2 times and I didn't ask. But here's what got me. In 40 years of that grinding poverty, Elias told me there was never a season so lean that he ate and Morrow didn't. People thought I was a fool, he said, giving good grain to an animal when I was going hungry. But you don't understand, there was no me eating and him not eating. That arrangement didn't exist. The river settled that. Whatever there was for the 2 of us, and if there wasn't enough for 2, then there wasn't enough, and we both went short together. Together, he kept coming back to that word. There was a stretch, he said, maybe 20 years back where they'd had a small good run, a steady hauling contract, a linta that was almost a home, a patch of ground. And a man had come through offering serious money for Morrow, who was in his prime then and famous in 3 counties for being able to pull loads that shouldn't move. Real money. Enough to change Elias' whole life. Enough to stop hauling and buy that patch of ground outright and maybe, finally, be something other than poor. I thought about it, Elias admitted, and I could tell it still cost him to admit, even 40 years on. God forgive me, I stood there and I thought about it, for about a minute. Because a minute is how long it took me to look at him and remember I couldn't sell the thing that pulled me out of the river any more than I could sell my own arm. You don't sell the reason you're alive, even when you're starving, especially then. He sent the man away. They stayed poor. And I sat there in that dark room realizing that the choice Elias had made 20 years ago, to stay poor rather than sell his friend, was the same choice in a smaller key that he'd made in the note pinned to his chest. Whatever you do to me, be kind to him. He'd spent his whole life refusing to trade Morrow's well-being for his own comfort, and he was still refusing, right up to the last square of paper. That's a kind of faithfulness I had never seen in a human being before, let me tell you plain. I'd seen loyalty. I'd seen love. I had never seen a man arrange his entire 40 years around a debt to an animal and never once, not even starving, not even broke, resent the paying of it. Now I have to tell you how they ended up on that road. Because you're wondering. You've been wondering since the first part. What a dying old man was doing loaded into a cart pulled by a blind donkey with no driver, out in the desert, alone. It was the sickness. It had come on him slow over the winter, Elias said, a thing in his belly that the drink he couldn't afford wouldn't have touched anyway, and by the spring he knew. A man knows. He'd stopped being able to keep food down, then stopped being able to stand for long, and he was living by then in a shack a full day's haul out from Arroyo Seco, and there was no one. That was the thing that broke my heart worst of all, worse almost than the dying. There was no one out there but the two of them. 40 years of carrying the world's loads, and at the end, there was not one human soul within a day's ride who would notice if Elias lived or died. But there was Morrow. When Elias got too weak to walk, he told me, he faced the plain fact that he was going to die alone in that shack and no one would find him, and worse, Morrow would be left tied up to starve beside a dead man, and he could not bear it. He said those words to me exactly. I could not bear it. Not the dying, the leaving Morrow to it. So he did the last hard thing his body had in it. Over the better part of a day, in stages, resting between each stage until the black spots cleared, he loaded that cart. He put in what little they owned, a few crates, some sacks, the things a life amounts to, not because he needed them, but because he needed the cart to look like a freight run, so that whoever found it would understand it was going somewhere on purpose, and not just an animal wandered off dragging a corpse. He wrote the note. He pinned it to his own chest with a sewing pin, his hands shaking so bad it took him, he said, the better part of an hour to work the pin through the cloth. And then he loaded himself. That's the part I can't get past, even now. Picture it. A dying man, too weak to stand, climbing up into his own cart and lying down among the crates and pulling 3 blankets over himself, and reaching out one last time to loose the wheel brake, and from inside the cart, from underneath the tarp, saying to his donkey the only word that mattered. "Town, Morrow, take us to town." And the donkey did. Blind, old, ribs like a barrel's staves. That animal took a bearing on a town he could not see, a day's haul across broken country with his dying friend hidden in the cart behind him, and he pulled. Elias faded in and out. He told me he didn't remember most of the journey. He was mostly gone by then. But he remembered surfacing once in the dark to the sound of Morrow breathing that terrible rhythmic breath, H-H-H, 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 and feeling the cart still moving under him, still climbing, still going, and thinking, he's going to do it. He's going to carry me the whole way. Of course he is. He carried me out of the river. He was always going to carry me the whole way. That's when I made my peace, Elias told me. Not before. I'd been fighting to stay awake, fighting to hang on, and it was that, feeling him still pulling in the dark, that let me finally let go and trust it. I knew wherever he was taking me was where I was meant to end up, because he'd never once in 40 years taken me anywhere but where I needed to be. And where Morrow took him, across all that dark and distance, guided by nothing but 40 years of knowing, was to a street where the load beat him at the steepest part, and the cart began to roll back toward a crowd of children, and an old blind donkey threw the last of himself against the harness to hold it, to the exact spot where a sour cowboy in a ruined hat sat his horse and had, for reasons he still can't fully explain, not quite managed to ride away. Morrow carried Elias to me. I don't say that to make myself the hero of it. Lord knows I'm not. I say it because I have come to believe in the years since that Morrow knew what he was doing better than I did, that some animals see with something other than eyes. He couldn't have known there'd be a man on that street who would look in the cart. Except he brought his friend to that exact spot at that exact moment, and I did look, and I've never been able to call it luck. I've tried. It won't hold the word. On the second night, Elias was worse. Sister Concepcion told me plainly, out in the yard where he couldn't hear, that it would likely be the last night, and that his suffering had gotten past what her herbs and prayers could ease, and she looked at me in a way I understood without her having to shame herself by saying it out loud. There were things a sister could not do and would not do and would go to God with a clean conscience for not doing. But she was telling me they were things that could, perhaps, mercifully be done by someone who was not bound by her vows. I want to be careful how I tell this next part, because it is the heaviest thing I carry, and I have never told it to a living soul before setting it down here. Elias was in agony, the kind that had stopped being a man in pain and become just pain wearing the shape of a man. And late in that second night, in a clear moment between the worst of it, he took my wrist in his cold fingers with a strength I didn't know he had left, and he pulled me down close to his mouth, and he asked me for the second hard thing. He asked me to end it. Not in those words. He was gentler than that and braver. He said, "You're a man who's put down animals that were suffering. It wasn't a question. You know how to make it quick and you know how to make it kind. I've done it myself 100 times for beasts I loved less than I love this one thing, my own worn-out life. I'm asking you, don't make me do the last of this the hard way. I've done everything the hard way. Let this one be quick." And there it was, the second choice, heavier than the first by a mountain. I'm not going to tell you it was a simple matter of right and wrong, because it wasn't, and anybody who tells you these things are simple has never been asked. I sat there with that dying man's hand around my wrist, and I felt the whole weight of it, the law of the territory, the law of the church that Sister Concepcion served. The law inside my own chest that I'd never had cause to test before, and I did not know what was right. I still don't, some nights. But I'm going to make you wait for what I did. Not to be cruel, to be honest, because in that room at that moment I did not decide quickly, and it wouldn't be true to the thing to pretend I did. I sat with it. And while I sat with it, holding a dying man's request in one hand and my own soul in the other, Morrow, who had been standing his silent watch this whole while, blind head bowed over Elias, Morrow did something that decided a piece of it for me. Something I've never been able to explain and have never tried very hard to. I'll tell you what he did, and what I did, and how the 3 days ended in the last part. I know I keep making you wait. I'm sorry for it. But some things you've earned by staying, and some things I can only bring myself to say once, all in a row without stopping. And that's how the ending has to come, all at once or not at all. Come to the last part. I'll finish it there. I'll tell you what the donkey did and what I chose and what it cost, and the one small thing that happened at the very end that has kept me, against all odds, believing there's mercy stitched into this hard world, if you know where to look, and if you're willing to be the one who looks. Here is what Morrow did. While I sat there frozen, holding Elias' request, unable to move toward it or away from it, the donkey lowered his head the last few inches and pressed his blind face against the old man's cheek, and he made a sound. It wasn't a bray. I'd never heard him bray the whole time. I don't think he had the breath left in him for it. It was low and soft, and it came up out of his chest more like a groan than a call, and it went on, rising and falling, and I realized after a moment that I was listening to a lullaby. That's the only word I have for it. The animal was singing to the man. In whatever way a donkey can, with whatever sound was left in him, that creature was doing the thing you do for someone you love who is frightened in the dark. He was making a sound to say, I'm here, I haven't gone anywhere, I'm right here. And Elias' grip on my wrist loosened. I looked down and his eyes had closed and the terrible clench in his face had gone slack, not the slackness of death, but the slackness of a man who has stopped being alone with his pain. The donkey's low sound was still going, and I understood, watching the two of them, that I had been asked to solve the wrong problem. Elias hadn't truly wanted me to kill him, not really. What he'd wanted, what the pain had made him beg for, was to not have to bear the end by himself. And the thing was, he never was by himself. He'd forgotten, in the worst of the pain, the one fact that had defined his entire life, that as long as Morrow drew breath, Elias would never face anything alone. The donkey remembered it for him. The donkey lay that reminder against his cheek in the dark, and sang it into him until the man could feel it again. So I made my choice, and my choice was that I would not do the thing he'd asked, not because I judged it wrong in every case. I've come to know peace on that larger question, and I won't pretend to for you. But because in this case, in that room, I could see that what he needed wasn't an ending. It was company through the ending. And that I could give. That we could all three give. I leaned down close to him. I'm not going to do that, I told him, soft. But I'm not going anywhere either, and neither is he. You hear that sound he's making. You're not doing this alone, Elias. You never once did anything alone in 40 years, and you're not starting now. We're going to stay right here with you, all the way, however long it takes. That's a promise, and I don't make those. He didn't open his eyes, but his mouth moved, and I bent to catch it, and what he said was, "That's better than what I asked for," a long breath. I always did ask for the wrong thing. Morrow knew better, he always knew better. And then he slept. A real sleep, the first in 2 days. And Morrow sang until he was sure of it, and then he too fell silent, and he stood over his sleeping friend with his blind eyes closed. And Sister Concepcion came and stood in the doorway and made the sign of the cross over all three of us, and did not come in. Elias lived 2 more days. That surprised everyone, Sister Concepcion most of all. She'd been certain the second night would be the last, and instead the man rallied, not toward recovery, there was never any hope of that, but toward something I can only call completion. It was as though, once he'd been reminded he wasn't alone, he stopped spending his strength on fear and had a little left over to spend on finishing things properly. He talked in those 2 days more than his body should have allowed. He told me the 40 years I've given you, and more besides that I've kept for myself. He asked me to describe Morrow to him, his own eyes being too far gone to see the animal he'd loved for 4 decades. And I did. I described that gray muzzle and those long, patient ears and the ribs I wished I didn't have to mention. And Elias listened with his eyes closed and a small smile, correcting me here and there. His left ear tips forward more than the right, he'd say. Has since he was young. You didn't mention that. And I'd look, and by God the man was right, and he hadn't seen his own donkey clearly in years, but he carried every line of him inside where the blindness couldn't reach. On the last afternoon he was very peaceful. The pain had backed off the way it sometimes does at the end, a mercy nobody understands, and he lay in a bar of light from the little window with his hand resting on Morrow's neck, and he said to me, out of a long silence, "I need you to do the third thing now." I'd been dreading it, because I'd known since the note that there'd be a third thing, and I'd known what it would be, and it was the one I had no answer for. "When I'm gone," Elias said, "he's going to want to follow, you understand me. He's followed me for 40 years, out of a river across every hard mile there was, all the way here at the end. When I go where he can't come, he's going to try to come anyway. He's going to lie down and quit, or he's going to grieve himself dead standing up in that yard, and I have watched animals do it, and it is a slow, terrible thing." His hand tightened on the donkey's neck. "I need you to give him a reason to keep pulling. After, I can't give it to him anymore. I need you to." I asked him how. How does a man give a grieving animal a reason to live? "The same way I got mine," he said. "Somebody has to need carrying. That's all it ever was, Cowboy. That's the whole secret of him and me. He needed something to pull out of a river, and there I was, and I needed something to pull me through 40 years, and there he was. He doesn't know how to be loved. Nobody ever taught him, but he knows down to the ground how to carry. So you find him something that needs carrying, and you let him, and that'll be the reason." I told him I would, and I meant it, though I had no earthly idea, sitting there, what shape the promise would take. Elias died that night in the light of a single candle, with his hand on his donkey's neck and my hand on his shoulder and Sister Concepcion's rosary going soft in the corner. He didn't struggle. At the very end he said the name once, Morrow, and the donkey lowered his head, and Elias' breath went out and didn't come back, and the room was very quiet. And then the donkey did the thing Elias had feared. He understood. I don't know how. The man had gone so gently there was hardly a sound to it. But that blind animal lifted his head and turned it toward the door and back to Elias and back to the door. And he made a sound I will hear on my own deathbed, a single broken cry. And then he tried to lie down beside the table, folding those old legs to get down onto the tile next to his friend, to stay with him, to go where he was going. "Don't let him watch," the note had said. It was too late for that. He'd watched. He'd known, and now he was trying to follow. I got him up. It took everything I had and everything Sister Concepcion had, and it was the hardest and most terrible thing, forcing a grieving animal back onto his feet against his own will to lie down and die. But I remembered the promise, and I remembered how, and I did the only thing I could think to do. There was a child at the mission. I haven't mentioned her because there was no room to until now. A girl, maybe 6, who'd been left at Santa Rita's door the winter before, an orphan, one of that country's countless orphans, being raised by the sisters until somebody or nobody came for her. She'd been watching all of this from the edges the way children do, wide-eyed and silent, and she'd taken a particular fascination with Morrow. And more than once I'd shooed her back from the yard. Now, in the worst of it, with the donkey trying to lie down and die on the tile beside the man he'd carried for 40 years, I did the only thing Elias' words had left me to do. I picked that little girl up. She weighed nothing. She was all eyes and knees, and I set her down gentle on Morrow's back. And I said into that blind ear, "She needs carrying, Morrow. There's nobody else. She's got no one and she can't walk the roads alone and she needs somebody strong enough to carry her. You're the only one. You hear me? You're the only one strong enough. She needs you." I don't know what I expected. I half expected nothing, expected the animal to fold up anyway and take the child down with him. Sister Concepcion's hand was hovering to snatch her back. But the donkey stood. He stood up under that child the way 40 years of instinct told him to stand up under a load that needed carrying, and something shifted in the whole set of his body. Some current came back into the wire, and his blind head lifted and his ears came up. The left one tipping forward more than the right, just like Elias said, and he took the weight. He took her weight, and he did not lie down. He grieved. Don't mistake me. He grieved for weeks, would stop in the middle of the road sometimes and just stand, blind head hanging, and I'd have to wait him out. But he did not die. Because every morning there was a child on his back who needed carrying, and he knew, down to the ground, how to carry, and that knowing was stronger than the grief. That's how Elias saved him one last time from beyond the door. He'd figured it out before he died. He'd known the shape of his own donkey's soul better than the donkey knew it himself, and he'd handed me the key to it with his last strength, and it worked. It worked. I buried Elias on the rise above the arroyo, at the spot where the road levels off, the exact spot where Morrow had held the cart against the grade, where I'd first put my shoulder to that load and understood what the animal had been doing alone. It seemed right. It was the last place the two of them had pulled together. And here is the small thing on the road that I told you was the real reason for all of it, the thing that's kept me believing. I took Morrow and the girl. What else was I going to do? I'd made a promise, and the promise had a child attached to it now, and a blind old donkey, and somewhere in those 3 days the sour cowboy who minded his own business and helped no stray dogs had quietly died and been replaced by a man I was still getting acquainted with. Sister Concepcion let the child go with me because she'd watched what happened in that yard and she understood, the way she understood everything, that the 3 of us were a load now that had to be carried together or not at all. We left Arroyo Seco a week later, and as we came down off that rise, back through the main street, the same street where the whole town had ignored an old donkey dragging a dying man, where a boy had thrown a stone, something happened that I have never been able to fully explain and have long since stopped trying to. They came out. Word had gone around the way it does in small towns of what had been in the cart, of the note, of the 40 years, of the blind donkey who'd carried a dying man out of the desert to a street that wouldn't look. And as we came down that street, the people who'd stepped around him a week before came out of their doors, and they stood, and they took off their hats. For a donkey. The freighter who'd cursed him stood with his hat over his heart. The woman who'd pulled her child away stood with that same child on her hip, pointing. And the boy who'd thrown the stone, the boy ran out ahead of us into the road, and I tensed. God help me. I thought he meant to throw another. But he had something in his hands, and he held it up as we passed, up toward the little girl on the donkey's back. And it was a fistful of desert flowers, the small, tough yellow ones that grow up out of nothing in that country, and the girl leaned down and took them. And the boy stepped back with tears standing in his eyes and said, "To the donkey, not to us," in a voice cracking with a shame far too heavy for a boy that age. "I'm sorry." Morrow couldn't see the flowers. He couldn't see the hats or the standing people or the boy's wet face. He was blind and he was old and he was grieving and he understood none of it. He just kept walking, carrying the child who needed carrying, the left ear tipped forward, taking the weight, doing the one thing he had always known how to do. But I saw it. I saw all of it. And I have carried that too these 11 years, alongside the harder things. The sight of a whole town that had ignored an animal to death coming out at last to bare their heads, 1 week too late for the man, but not somehow too late for whatever it was that mattered. Because I don't think it was ever really about the town seeing Morrow. I think it was about the town, for one moment on one street, seeing what they'd walked past, seeing the weight that people and animals carry in plain sight while the rest of us step around it, irritated that it's slowing our way. Everyone had ignored the old donkey dragging the heavy cart, and what was inside the cart in the end was a mirror. It showed the whole town what they were. And to their credit, 1 week late, hats in hand, they didn't look away from it a second time. Morrow lived 3 more years. The girl grew. She named herself after nobody and let Sister Concepcion's God in the open road raise her, and she and that donkey became their own version of what Elias and Morrow had been, a load carried together, a debt neither of them could name and neither would trade. When Morrow finally lay down for the last time, it was in a green place I'd found for him, well fed and unhurried and old, and the girl was there with her hand on his neck, and he went the way Elias went, gentle, not alone. I've never told anyone the whole of it until now. I burned the pages 4 times because words kept making it smaller. Maybe they still do. Maybe you've read all this and what you've got is a smaller thing than what happened on that road 11 years ago, and if so, I'm sorry, and the failing is mine, not the story's. But I'll tell you the one thing I'm sure of, the thing I'd want you to take up off this page and carry out into your own life, because a story you don't carry anywhere is just words. There is weight moving through the world right now in plain sight that everyone is stepping around. Someone dragging a load up a grade with the last of what they've got, and the whole street too busy to look. And you will not always know what's in the cart. Most of the time you won't. It'll be easier to curse it for slowing you down, or to throw your stone, or just to ride on by, because it's not your donkey and it's not your problem and you've got salt and coffee and chain to buy. But every so often, maybe once in a life, maybe more if you're the looking kind, you'll feel that first crack in the thing you've kept sealed. And you'll have a choice. You can turn your horse's head, or you can get down and put your shoulder to a stranger's load and look inside. I looked inside. It cost me the man I used to be, and I have never once wanted him back. The little girl is grown now. She has a child of her own, and a small farm, and I am old, and my knee still aches in the exact way it ached the day I got down off my horse. She came to see me last spring. She brought the boy, her son, and as they were leaving she stopped in the doorway, the way Sister Concepcion used to, and she said there was something she'd been meaning to ask me for years and never had. "That day on the street," she said, "when you set me up on his back, how did you know it would work? How did you know he'd stand?" And I told her the truth, which is that I didn't. I didn't know. I only knew what a dying man had told me about the soul of a donkey, and I chose to believe it, and I acted on the belief before I could talk myself out of it, and that, not knowing, but choosing to believe and then moving, that's the closest thing to faith I've ever had my hands on. She thought about that a while. Then she nodded and picked up her boy and settled him on her hip the way you settle a load you were built to carry, and she went on down the road toward home. I watched them go until they were small. And I thought about a flooded river 40-some years gone, and a young donkey nobody owned wadding into it after a drowning stranger for no reason anyone could ever name. And I thought, it's still going. Whatever came out of that river all those years ago, it didn't stop when Elias died or when Morrow died. It's out there on the road right now, on that girl's hip, in that boy's someday hands. Some things you can't undo. You can only keep them and pass them on. and trust the ones who come after to know, down to the ground, how to carry.